Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026. Hello, and welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians. Today, we have a very special episode coming to you because we are joined by a very special guest. I would like to introduce you to Mike Tanner, Senior Fellow at FREOPP. And I always forget what the acronym is, but you'll tell me. Mike and I have been friends for many, many years. We met when I was in DC, and not only is he special because he is my friend, he's also special because he is a very renowned policy expert. You have spoken in front of Congress, testified to Congress, I don't know how many times. You've been on every television station. You have received every award. You just a very, very impressive resume. And so you've focused on welfare and poverty for the last, 10, 15 years. And very lately, you've been working on housing and homelessness. Not very lately, but for the past few years, you've been working on housing and homelessness. So as we're a podcast about how to solve the problem of homelessness, it's so wonderful to have you talk to us about some of the policies that can actually make a difference.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be down here in Huntsville. It's always a pleasure, of course, to be somewhere besides Washington, D.C., so wouldn't let that go to your head right away. Yeah, but it is great to be down here. It's great to be with you and an organization that is really trying to make a difference. There's a lot of think tanks, there's a lot of people who want to talk about things, but there's not a lot of organizations that actually try to do good on the ground, and it's great to be with you and have a chance to partake in that.
Thank you. So you spoke to us last night about basically summarizing a paper that you've written, or you're in the process of writing, that's going to come out soon through FREOPP, about essentially there are the solutions that the left poses for the problem of homelessness, and there are solutions that the right poses for the problem of homelessness. And you kind of look at how neither of these solutions is really likely to be effective based on the evidence we have. But there are 5 policies which the evidence indicates can probably actually work. So yeah, if you could give us kind of an overview of what you found.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to look at facts and to look at the data when we're analyzing public policies on homelessness.
I don't know. That's pretty unusual in the policy world.
It's amazing how many people miss that particular step. Just saying.
Well, so people really get overcome by emotions, I think, on both sides of this. And this is an emotional issue.
Absolutely.
When you look at that homelessness. It is
sure.
something that the people who are suffering from homelessness, they are legitimately suffering. There's more than 500,000 Americans living without homes now, 500 to 600 at least in Huntsville. And we know that about 8,000 homeless people die on the streets every year, and not to mention all the other problems that go with it. It's kind of miserable existence. And then we know that it adds enormous costs to local governments, state governments, the federal government. It can hurt business climate. It can create all sorts of quality of life issues with increased crime, and there's all sorts of problems that go with it. So it's certainly something that people can get emotional about. And people want easy solutions. People want slogans, but they don't necessarily want to look at the data about what works and what doesn't. I think it's very important that when we start looking at how to treat homelessness, we need to look at who is homeless and why, because there's very distinct groups of the homeless population, and they take very different solutions when it comes time to try to how to deal with it. For example, one of the most visible homeless, the ones you're most likely to encounter on the street corner or camping in the local park, things like that, are people with either substance abuse problems or mental illness.
Or both.
And there's a huge overlap, and we can argue about whether there's a sort of a chicken and egg thing here, because it is true that, if life on the street is as bad as it is, a lot of people self-medicate, a lot of people take drugs, or their mental illness gets worse once they're on the street.
And there is evidence to indicate that homelessness does cause and or exacerbate mental illness and drug addiction, as you would imagine.
That's right. People are not exactly getting treated when they're on the street.
Well, it's just stressful as all hell. It's unsafe. It's uncomfortable. It's miserable. It's embarrassing. It's stressful. So anything that exacerbates somebody's stress, I mean, it causes all kinds of physical problems too. People develop hypertension and diabetes earlier when they're without housing, and it's all connected.
And we know there's enormous cost that goes with treating homeless people in emergency rooms and so on. It's not like they have health insurance and a regular primary care physician to take care of them. And yet they develop all sorts of illnesses that are pretty severe and can lead to problems in society. I mean, we know that tuberculosis and
hepatitis B, I want to say, Hep
Yep.
C. Sorry, it's Hep A that is from lack of sanitation. There's Hep C from bodily fluids. Yes, there's all kinds of communicable diseases that are harder to control when you are having a large homeless population.
so it's a very good reason for us to want to care about the homeless, both as a humanitarian thing because we don't want people to suffer, but also in terms of our economics, in terms of our tax base, in terms of our business climate. All of those things matter, and so that's why this is such a big issue these days.
And it's truly an issue where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Even if you're somebody who's doesn't like government spending, you're going to have fewer total outlays by avoiding homelessness than by dealing with homelessness once it happens.
Well, that's right. And we're in a situation today where actually homelessness is increasing.
Yeah.
Not just because we're not getting people off the street, but because more people are falling to the street. If you look to Los Angeles, for example, every week about 3,000 people leave homelessness, or about 2,000 people rather, they find housing, which is great. That's accomplishing something. But if 2,000 people are leaving and 3,000 people are falling to the street, the situation is only going to get worse.
Absolutely. Okay, so I derailed you. So there are two kinds of people who experience homelessness, essentially. You've got people who are suffering from severe mental illness and or drug addiction, and then...
Yeah, I mean, and they're the ones you're most likely to encounter, but they are actually a minority of the homeless population. They're more likely than the general population to have substance abuse problems or mental illness, but still, that's not who makes up the majority of the homeless. The majority of the homeless are actually people who fell to the street because they couldn't afford housing. It probably surprises people to realize that more than half of homeless people actually are employed.
And so that really blows up the myth that the rise in homelessness or rates of homelessness are caused by mental illness and drug addiction. That can't be true because it's only a minority of people who experience homelessness.
And if you look at the variation between states, which states have huge homeless populations, which ones don't, you don't see mental illness or substance abuse problems accounting for a huge amount of that differentiation.
Right.
I think of drug abuse, it's about 6% of the difference between the highest and lowest states when it comes to homelessness. And it's very similar when you get to mental illness. I mean, mental illness affects everybody. You're not more likely to be mentally ill in California, let's say, than you are in Alabama. But you have about half of all unhoused homeless people living in the state of California. That can't just be because it drives people crazy to live in California or something.
Despite what the voting, not that we can talk in Alabama, but anyway, yes, okay.
So you have to, the dealing with people who have mental illness or people who have substance use problems is very different than dealing with people who can't afford housing. And I think if we try to lump them all together and come up with a one-size-fits-all solution, you're not going to help either group, and you're going to end up just wasting you a lot of money.
Yeah. So let's talk about what the solutions, because I do think that is behind kind of the left solution is kind of the assumption that everyone who is without housing needs mental health and addiction resources, which isn't necessarily true. So do you want to talk about that, or do you want to talk about the right solution?
Well, start with things we shouldn't do, because
that's what I mean.
The first thing we can do is stop doing bad things or stop doing things that waste money or make the problem worse.
Another radical proposal.
On the left, the solution today is what's called Housing Now, and it's Housing First, and it's a companion, which is permanent supportive housing, which is how you essentially provide housing first. And this is the idea that what you need to do is take people who are living on the street now and simply move them into housing, and not just temporary housing or not housing with services, but just get a roof over their head and then keep them there. And often this is done by subsidizing them to stay in the housing. And like this, I mean, this comes from a very good place mentally, but
Well, and I think it's based on something that is true, which is that you cannot get better without housing.
right. I mean, people who are living in the street need a roof over their head.
Right. So yes, I do believe we do need to house people immediately and without precondition because they're not going to get better otherwise. But I agree with the problems you have with the way it's implemented.
Well, it used to be that housing was sort of a tiered approach. The basic idea was to get people in a shelter right away, get that roof over their head.
Right.
And shelters weren't designed to be permanent housing or anything like that. They were designed to be a cot and a bed and a square meal type of thing. And then eventually they'd move people to more transitionary housing, which had services with it, which dealt with mental illness or substance abuse if you had those problems, or job search, or how to get a better job if you needed to be able to afford housing, things of that nature. And then finally you moved people into housing, which was not necessarily, might be subsidized, but it might not be. But then they were finally able to move in there. Now we've gone to this idea that we've wiped out the first two levels of that, and we simply move people directly to the subsidized housing.
Well, but I think that what we have to consider is that the model that we used to use worked in the environment in which we were operating. And that is an environment in which there were only two ways that someone, for the most part, lost their housing. Either they were in a spot where they lost it because they had essentially mental illness and or drug addiction, and so they needed intervention. So yeah, if someone either lost their housing because they couldn't manage life, or they lost their housing because something happened that made them unable to afford housing, which is still the case. The issue is when housing was cheaper on average and more abundant, then it was easier to get someone who just lost their job or lost a spouse or, needed to sign up for public assistance, like whatever they needed to get back into housing, like you could do pretty easily. That's not the case anymore.
No, and that's why I say I think that sort of housing now type of approach comes from a good place and heart. It's looking at a very real problem.
Right.
Problem is it doesn't seem to work very well for a couple of reasons. One is it doesn't reach the underlying problems. It doesn't, whether that problem is income or that problem is substance abuse or that problem is mental illness, it doesn't deal with any of those underlying problems. So we do know that you put people into housing, subsidized housing, and over the years, they tend to drop out of it, and they tend to end up more like on the street. The second is, if we're going to deal with the problem of housing costs, you want to actually bring down the cost of housing. And
So let me underline the point you just made, because I think it's really important. Sure. So the purpose of permanent supportive housing is the supportive part is supposed to offer services for mental illness and drug addiction. And they do. And when you look at, and you correct me because I'm just parroting what I read in your report and other places, but essentially there's a subset of people who are really gung-ho about getting well, and they do really well in permanent supportive housing. They show up to the meetings, they do the work, they stay housed. But for people who just want a roof over their head and aren't really willing to do the work or able to do the work of taking advantage of the supportive part of permanent supportive housing, the data shows, and that's most people, unfortunately, that within 10 years, they end up unhoused again, on average.
That's exactly right. And that assumes that the supportive part of the permanent supportive housing is actually there.
Right.
In far too many cases, there's no supportive thing. Housing first becomes housing only.
Right.
And we don't provide any additional services. And in fact, you can make the services worse in some case. If you have a person who's, let's say, gung-ho about getting off of drugs or getting drugs they need or whatever it is, and you put them in a house in the right next door, and that next apartment over is the local drug dealer who's not interested in getting off, that's not going to make things any easier for the people. The other problem is permanent supportive housing tends to take housing actually off the market because subsidized housing sort of buys out low-cost housing, and it's often not low cost. I mean, was it down here they're looking at $400,000 a unit for subsidized housing?
That's right.
That's not exactly low-cost housing, but you're taking those units off the market, which means there's less housing overall. You have basic supply and demand, and of course, that then raises the cost of housing for everyone else.
Right. So what we've found through the data is that you cannot solve affordable housing without more housing, and housing first implemented without creating more units of housing just creates a musical chairs where one person gets a home, but in order for that to happen, the home has to be freed up, which means somebody else loses a home. So you end up there is no place in the US where housing first has been implemented where the rate of homelessness has decreased, because you cannot decrease the rate of homelessness without building more homes.
Right. Actually, as I say, the only variation now is actually Houston, which of course is one of the least zoned cities out there, which actually has seen an increase in its housing stock and therefore has seen a decline in homelessness even as they move to this. But if you go to places there where they've highly touted housing first, California, for example, or Utah, what you find when you look into the data is the homelessness population has actually increased despite moving to housing first.
Right. Because again, if you don't have more units, you have the same number of people without housing, or you have more people without housing because housing continues to get more expensive faster than average incomes. So you just find more and more people losing their homes.
That's right. So you could actually be making the situation worse. It's also, housing first seems to be sort of an after the fact, an ex post type of approach. It's taking people after they've ended up on the street and they're saying, well, you've been living on the street for 6 months, now let's put you in a house. Wouldn't it be much better to try to keep them from falling to the street in the first place, which means, of course, either treating their problems up front or lowering the cost of housing, or both?
Absolutely. We talk about, wouldn't it be amazing if we had some kind of algorithm that could take everybody's stats and reliably predict who is most at risk of falling into homelessness? But it's like, or we could just build more homes and prevent a lot of people from falling into homelessness.
Yeah, I mean, any solution ultimately is going to require that I'm sure we'll come back to this again and again throughout this broadcast, but any solution is going to take...
this whole project.
is going to take lowering the cost of housing, and of course we know how to do that, and we'll be getting into that, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Okay, so those are some of the problems with housing first.
Meanwhile, the right solution, of course, is to simply lock people up. It's to send in the police, preferably with a bulldozer, bulldoze the homeless encampments and move people out. Where are you moving them to is an interesting question. You tend to take people out of Park A. We'll send in a sweep to Park A. We'll take everybody out of it and we'll move them over to Park B, and then we solved the problem. You might have made it a little less visible for a little while, but that's about all you've done.
Well, it's not all you've done. You've made the problem much worse.
Yes, because certainly locking people up over the weekend, you have to deal with their possessions, of course, so you basically trash them, so their tent is gone, often including their identification, their medication if they're on medication.
Their mobility devices.
Yes, and then you split up, of course, couples that are out there, which leaves women often without a protector on the street, and we know that sexual abuse and other types of abuse for women who are homeless is endemic. You're often making that worse. You put the person in jail, and what do? You keep them there for a week, and then you let them out. What are they going to do? They've still got no place to go. They've now lost the things that were making it possible for them maybe to become escaping homelessness, and you're simply throwing them back out there with the wolves. You're just making the problem worse.
And it's incredibly stressful. It's stressful to move. These people are homeless. They can't hire a mover. They often don't have vehicles. Like, how are they literally supposed to move? They're separating, like you said, couples. It's separating people from communities. It's making it difficult for people so often people will choose to camp near their jobs and or services. Well, when you force them to move, that gets them farther from their communities, jobs and services, and healthcare. So,
yeah. I mean, we're not minimizing the quality of life issues that drives the motivation behind moving into policing. I mean, the fact is that, well, first of all, we should recognize that the homeless are more likely to be a victim of crime than to commit crimes. But when you're coming to crimes like theft and petty theft, shoplifting, smash and grabs out of cars, things like that, you do get increases if you have large concentrations of homelessness. You do have certainly problems that lead to people less likely to patronize local businesses if there's homeless encampments across the street with all the problems that go with health and cleanliness and things that go with that. So there's reason and there's costs that are, of course, accrued to local governments. So we understand why they want to move people away, but it's still not dealing with the problem. They're sort of papering it over, making it aesthetically more pleasing, but not solving the problem.
Not solving the problem, making it worse. I mean, we've had reports of people actually dying as a result of camp clearings. you can imagine, again, when people lose their possessions, their ID, their mobility devices, their medication, that would be terrible for their health. So, and you just, again, these are people who are in desperate need of help, and you're creating an unnecessary adversarial relationship between them and law enforcement.
Yeah, if you actually ask police, they will tell you they don't like being used to clear the homeless population. They're not trained for it. They don't know how to deal with mental illness. Police officers are designed to lock people up, not be psychiatrists.
Right.
So they're not trained to deal with this sort of thing. They're dealing with situations that are very volatile, that can escalate quickly. We know on both sides, police get hurt and homeless people get hurt in these situations as they escalate. So the police don't like it. The homeless certainly don't like it. It doesn't solve the problem. But yet there's a great movement out there right now to try to toughen up law enforcement, to create more laws dealing with homelessness. We already know most cities have laws that make it illegal to sleep on the sidewalk, to sit in public, to panhandle. These things are all illegal, and most homeless people encounter police repeatedly throughout the course of a day.
I think this comes from a basic kind of conservative misconception that people choose to be homeless.
Yeah, I think it's kind of generally the idea that poverty is a moral failure,
right,
and that people are poor because they've made bad choices, bad decisions in life, and homelessness is the result of the same type of bad choices and bad decisions, whether it's using drugs or things of that nature. Now, there's certainly are people out there who have chosen this as a lifestyle and what have you, but they're very few and far between. This is not a great life for people to live.
Well, and it's also like, okay, well, what does it mean to make a choice? Every choice we make is necessarily constrained. The reality is everyone who's homeless is operating under a constrained set of choices.
Well, that's right. And those are choices we need to be addressing, not just for homelessness, but for poverty more generally. We need to be looking at what happens when your job is no longer relevant. We need to be looking at what happens if your school system is terrible. What happens if you have a criminal justice system that burdens people with criminal records? All of these sorts of things that we deal with in terms of poverty generally have an impact on homelessness.
I agree. I do think that it's frustrating when people focus on poverty too much, because poverty does not explain homelessness. We have not had increases in poverty that are concomitant with increases in homelessness. We've had increases in housing costs that are concomitant with increases in what I'm saying is that homelessness is caused by increased housing costs far more than increases in poverty.
Well, it's a relationship between what you can pay and the cost of housing. So,
right.
So poverty is a condition of that. But you're absolutely right in that the evidence shows that very unpoor locations like California, I mean, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, these are not poor communities, and yet they have very high rates of homelessness. Now, part of that is how do we define what poverty really is, which is a whole debate.
That's another paper
in itself. That's coming, so we'll have that debate as well. But part of it is the fact that you have to match housing costs to what people can afford to pay, and the things that disrupt their life.
And the things that I would say more than poverty, again, the cost of housing has risen faster, way faster than inflation. That is the main cause. But I think we also need to look at, poverty is also obviously awful, but I think about it in terms of precarity. I think what we have in the U.S., much more than a problem of poverty, is a problem of precarity, where it's very, very easy to start to slide in such a way that you just really cannot get a foothold again, where you get a parking ticket or a traffic violation that results in a fine that you can't pay, so you go to jail, so you lose your job, so you lose your license, and you just fall farther and farther behind, that you just cannot, and you end up on the street because there aren't not only are there not safety nets to catch people, but there are slippery slopes that push people down at every step of the way. Like, poverty is expensive in the United States, and it is stressful, which then makes it difficult for you to use the resources that you do have wisely. And so this precarity, I think, is something that we really need to look at. What are the systems we have in place that not only trap people in poverty, but it further entrench that poverty as they go along and just try to survive?
Yeah, I think precarity is actually a terrific definition that I would think should be part of the definition of poverty. It is.
Oh, for sure.
Poverty is not just a dollar amount versus an income versus outgo type of thing. It is your ability to become self-sufficient, to take care of yourself, to actually rise with your talents. And we have a situation in many of these areas, particularly where there's high housing costs, where people have found the lowest rung on that housing affordability ladder now. If anything interrupts them, if they get sick, if they have a criminal problem, if they simply lose their job for whatever reason it might be, there's no place for them to go from that except to the street.
Right.
And that's why we see so many people in places like San Francisco and L.A. Living on the street who are employed. I did work out there for a number of years on a project looking at poverty in California and encountered people who were state employees, emergency room nurses, public school teachers, who were basically living in their cars because they couldn't afford an apartment. We know that about 20% of people who are homeless are families. And these are not people, again, who have massive drug abuse problems or massive substance use problems. They're people simply, something happened in their lives and they were not able to find a place to live.
I know a teacher in this area who has to go to a mandatory training session to identify students she believes are currently unhoused.
And of course, this is going to have ongoing problems because people who are living on the street are not going to learn the same way. They're
Right.
not, and they're going to end up in problems finishing school in the future,
Right.
and lead them back into poverty. Poverty is a cycle
Absolutely.
that we have to break.
Absolutely. Okay. All that's depressing. So let's talk about solutions.
There are answers actually out there. There are things that we know work, that the evidence builds up. They're not, sexy. They're not glamorous, but they work, and they often are neglected in terms of how we solve homelessness and poverty problems.
Let's talk about them.
Well, the very first one is obvious, and it stems from what we've already been discussing, and that is we need to bring down the cost of housing.
Amen.
There are study after study done by the Congressional Budget Office, by the Office of Management and Budget, by any number of universities, all of which reach the same conclusion, which is the fact that if housing costs go up, so does homelessness. About a 1% increase in rents leads to about a 1% increase in the homeless population. So we've got to bring down those costs of housing, particularly cost of rent. And here's the surprise. If you want to bring down the cost of housing, you need to build housing.
What?
Crazy.
Somehow housing didn't abolish the laws of supply and demand.
I'm shocked.
We have a demand for housing. There's lots of people who want housing. We have a growing population for various reasons, most of which is good. But that means we need more housing for them, and at the same time we're restricting supply of housing. And so much of that restriction is being done arbitrarily through things like exclusionary zoning laws. There's other things we should be looking at, of course, that, things like there's certainly environmental regulations, there's impact fees, there's a variety of things that can raise the cost of housing. The tariffs on lumber, Canadian lumber drives up housing costs. Our ridiculous anti-immigration policy drives up labor costs. All of things add to it. But the biggest thing that adds to the cost of housing that's outside of developers' control is essentially exclusionary zoning laws, and we know that that's a big deal.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I feel like one thing that a lot of people will say is, why don't people just move to where demand is lower than supply? Places like Detroit or, places in Ohio, Rust Belt towns where you've got a ton of cheap housing stock. And to me, the obvious answer is because there aren't good jobs there. There aren't communities there that these people are already embedded in. There aren't opportunities. When you look at the United States, something like 90% of the best jobs are being created in like 8 superstar cities.
Yeah, it's a job thing. It's also even bigger than that, as you mentioned, a community thing. People don't move as easily as people think they do.
Geographic mobility is down.
And I can recall one of the big things that conservatives used to talk about for years was welfare magnets. The idea that if you had a city or a state that had high welfare benefits, people were going to flood to your state to do it. It turns out people will move a short distance for higher welfare benefits. They'll move from Chicago to Milwaukee, for example, if that was the case. But people aren't going to move from Chicago to California, they don't move from Mississippi to Chicago. And the reason for that is they have communities that they've built up. Even homeless populations have communities. They have family. They have people. They have churches that they belong to. They have things that they've done all their life. People don't give that up easily. And I think that the evidence suggests that people are not moving huge different distances. If you look at the surveys of the homeless population in various cities and towns, almost all of them are born there. Or at least if they weren't born there, they lived there for much of their lives.
Right.
They didn't flood into an area because, gee, this is where we can get best homeless benefits or the best housing or the things like warm weather. People always say, well, people move to Florida or California because of the weather. If they're homeless, they don't want to sleep in Buffalo. But people actually do stay on the streets in Buffalo because that's where they grew up.
That's true. And it ignores that if people... It's like, why would we force people to move to places they don't want to be just because we've artificially made housing expensive where they do want to be? And also, it greatly decreases economic growth for people to be where they're not productive. When people are allowed to move where housing is expensive, but jobs are plentiful and the economy is growing, there's agglomeration effects from that are very useful to the whole country and the whole world, actually.
Well, that's right. If you have a community that's growing because you've got a great economy, you want people to be able to move there. That's what keeps the great economy going.
Right.
I mean, if suddenly people have to stop moving to your town because they can't find housing, that's not a place that businesses are likely to relocate to.
Yeah. Or if they are, they're having to pay them a lot more money, the workers a lot more money, or we have shortages. I mean, that's what we're facing in Huntsville right now, is we're at a place where our middle income workers can't afford housing. The price of housing has leapt beyond middle income salaries.
Well, and again, we see this relationship between those salaries that are not keeping up with the cost of living, the higher housing costs, and increases in homelessness. Right. That's why you see both talk about differences, but you saw both the Obama administration's Council on Homelessness and the Trump administration's Council on Homelessness both say you had to deal with zoning laws if you wanted to bring down the rates, bring down housing costs and the rates of homelessness.
That's true. I've forgotten about that. That's so interesting. So we're going to upzone. We're going to deal with the permitting issues, perhaps, depending on the jurisdiction. After that, after you get a lot more housing built, what's the next step?
Well, to say, if we can prevent more people from sliding into homelessness, we've got off to a good start. So Definitely. That's why the housing is so important. The second part of that is we have to deal with people who are homeless now. And there's a couple of ways to look at that. One is we have to deal with those people who have substance abuse and mental health issues. That means we have to provide the services for them. We have to provide mental health services. We have to provide drug abuse treatment, or provide them with the drugs that they need if that's what's necessary. You know, we've kind of came a long way from the sort of institutionalization era that we lived up to until the 1950s, and then it began to gradually decrease after that. And there was a reason for deinstitutionalization. First of all, many of these institutions were monstrous. There was abuse, there was warehousing, there was people crammed into worse than cells, often naked and unfed and unwashed. There was guards that would sexually abuse the women in these institutions. I mean, the stories of the horrors of them were true. So we wanted to get people out of them. Second, we created drugs that could treat things like schizophrenia and whatever. It wasn't felt that you needed to sort of lock a schizophrenic up. You could treat them and put them back into a productive life. And third, we ended up with a situation where Medicaid funding changed and would no longer fund institutions but would fund community centers instead, which made a lot of governors decide to close their mental health institutions that they had to pay for and shift that cost to the federal government. Part of the problem was there was never any follow-up to this. There were supposed to be community health centers. There were supposed to be people who ensured that people who were on drugs now would take them. There were supposed to be people who were enabled to deal with people who had problems that couldn't be easily solved out in a community setting. None of this was created. The last bill, I believe it was, that John F. Kennedy signed into law was for community health centers. You're supposed to have 5,000 centers and only about 1,500 were ever funded. So we simply didn't provide the services necessary to treat people who have real problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I do want to just take a moment to differentiate. I would say that there are actually three kinds of homeless people. I mean, obviously, there are many, many kinds, but for the purposes of this discussion, I think you can divide people who are unhoused into three categories. One is people who just need more affordable housing. Like their income is not such that they can afford housing at this point. Those people, you solve homelessness by building more homes and bringing down the average cost of housing, no problem. There are people in the second category who are not going to be able to afford housing in a market rate economy. Like they are on public assistance or they need public assistance, and that's just what's going to happen. I think you solve that problem by giving those people cash, and then they can use that cash to pay.
Yeah, there's actually a new study on that came out of, I believe, Vancouver, that showed that if you gave people, homeless people, cash, they got out of homelessness.
Yes. There's actually a bunch of studies on giving cash assistance, and they show that it's super helpful. As it turns out, when someone needs money and you give them money, that helps.
You mean they didn't use it on drugs and other things? They actually bettered their lives with it? Oh,
on average, yes. Obviously, there are exceptions, but for the most part, yeah, people used it for the things that they needed.
Yeah, there's several studies out there that show that cash benefits, people don't use them for vice goods, whether tobacco or alcohol or drugs or whatever, or, movie tickets and things like that, any more than the general population at large.
That's true.
Yeah.
And so that gets rid of the government having to be a landlord or manage companies to manage housing, or the voucher system, which has lots of problems if you just give families cash. But then there's the third category of people experiencing homelessness, and these are people for whom cheap housing and cash assistance is not going to be enough.
Yeah, we're back again to this group that we talked about earlier, the people who have severe substance abuse problems, severe mental illness.
Right.
Now, if you make the services available, most of them will actually take advantage of it.
Yes.
Because most people don't want to, we don't want to live on the street. Most people who have problems want those problems solved.
Right.
And so you can get people into treatment without coercive action for most people, but not all.
Right.
There are people out there who have simply so far gone that they are not able to make choices and decisions for themselves. And we do have to find a way to deal with them in a way that's going to protect their rights and their autonomy, but also going to ensure that they get the treatments they need.
And I want to say something here. I don't think I'd really ever thought about conservatorship before I moved to San Francisco. But if this idea had been posed to me earlier in my life, I would have been very knee-jerk against it. I was very much like, everyone needs autonomy. Everyone should have the right to decide basic things for themselves, whether they take their medication, where they sleep. Like, every person should be able to decide for themselves. Living in San Francisco changed my mind. Living in San Francisco opened my eyes to the fact that, as nice as that sounds, you're not actually helping a certain subset of the population by giving them that autonomy, because they don't actually have that autonomy, because they're not capable of making decisions to care for themselves. That's just the reality of the situation. There is a subset of the population where it's actually cruel to not step in.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think on both parts of that. I think that we do need to be careful with how we use forced treatment and forced institutionalization and conservatorship, because they've been abused in the past. We know that recalcitrant women or LGBTQ people or people who are political dissidents have been institutionalized as punishment for the fact that we didn't like their lifestyles. So we've got to be very careful that we're protecting the individual's rights as we do this. On the other hand, it's not exactly being compassionate to let someone freeze to death on the street because they are not capable of deciding to move indoors.
Right.
Or, if you have someone who's a threat to themselves, threat to the public at large, you're going to have to deal with that in some way. Now, I think that conservatorships are a good way to handle this. They're different than law enforcement. You're not punishing people. You're not putting them in jail, because it's not like they're going to get treated in jail, and not like we're going to deal with their mental health problem while we got them locked up in the Huskow. So I think what we need to do is provide them with different types of options and different types of enforcement on this, and that's where conservatorship comes in. California actually enacted recently a new approach to this, which I think could be a model for the nation in this regard. First of all, they strengthened what you could be put under conservatorship for, so that it could be used for people who are simply not able to care for themselves and are living on the street.
Could you just quickly define a conservatorship?
A conservatorship is where someone else has control over your decisions, and it was most often originally used in terms of financial situations.
And for elderly people.
For elderly people who could who had Alzheimer's or whatever and couldn't pay their nursing home bill, someone else could write the checks and make decisions in terms of when they were going to go to the nursing home or what they were going to be treated for, things of that nature. You didn't want people being able to just send Nigerian prince their entire life savings, so someone else had to manage their financial circumstances. It's expanded beyond that now to a lot of other areas where people can make decisions in life. Basically, the conservatorship spells out which areas of life that people would make. And in terms of these folks with mental illness or substance use problems or are living on the street, it can be simply requiring them to seek treatment. It can be requiring them to seek a shelter bed if necessary, things of that nature. What California did was say there could be intervention by relatives. So if it was your cousin or your brother or your son that's living on the street, you could apply for a conservatorship. First responders could intervene if there was no one else. If you didn't know who was any of the relatives involved, first responders could do it. Police could do it under very limited circumstances as well. So there's a variety of places that you can take people and put them in conservatorship. They were then sent to what was called a conservatorship court, where they are provided with a public defender. So someone is protecting their lives, and we know that it's not just being an abusive case, or where I'm trying to get my grandma's money, so I'm going to have her locked up type of thing. Though they used to happen. We have someone standing in for the person who's being put under conservatorship. The court can then order various types of treatment. They can order them to go into substance abuse treatment. They can order them to go to shelter. They can institutionalize them if necessary. People, if they can refuse, they can propose alternative treatment, whatever. But the court can rule ultimately what has to be done, including against their will.
And I believe it's reviewed every 6 months.
I believe that's correct. This is being very careful to be protective, but at the same time, as people who can't make decisions for themselves, someone else has to make those decisions for them.
Yeah. And I know in San Francisco, or I'd heard that there's like 5 to 10 to 15 people who they describe as frequent flyers. So these are people, all the cops know who they are. All the emergency room nurses know who these people are. It's the same people. They come in again and again. Again, they are not able to make decisions that would lead them to not constantly be in the emergency room. And San Francisco just lacked the legal mechanism to intervene, to stop these people from going through the cycle over and over again. And I just think
it's the same here. My dad, he's retired HBD, but there was a set of there would be the essentially frequent flyers in parts of Huntsville that they just get a call almost every day. They would have to come pick them up, they'd be standing outside Starbucks screaming at people or just other stuff. And you have the same thing here.
So we see actually this was actually pushed by one of the most liberal legislators in the California Senate, Scott Wiener, who has been also been terrific on housing issues.
Love him.
But certainly has stepped in and said that, look, there's nothing compassionate about leaving these people on the street to die.
Right, exactly. All right, love it. What else?
Well, I think we also need to allow flexibility between cities and states and what have you. There's a vast difference between L.A., which has 50 or 60,000 homeless people living on its streets, and Huntsville, which has 500 to 600. The solutions that you need in Huntsville may broadly be the same as what you need in L.A., housing, mental health benefits, conservatorship, things of that nature. But how you're going to implement them, how you're going to target them, how much you're going to spend on them, which is going to be the priority, is going to vary greatly from state to state. And I think you have to give cities a certain amount of flexibility to do that. Part of the problem that we have right now is the money from Washington particularly is directed to specific things. Housing first, the new $8-9 billion that the Biden administration just put out as part of its housing problem can only go towards housing first. Well, maybe you want to use that for other purposes in Huntsville because you think it'll be more effective. Those are the type of things that we should be giving more autonomy to localities on. And then finally, as we talked earlier, I think we need to look at the whole context of poverty and precarity, as I think you wonderfully put it. We need to be able to ensure that people are not in a position where a problem in their life leads them to being homeless. And that has to deal with much larger societal issues. We need, obviously, criminal justice reform. We need education reform. We need to create more jobs that are paying good wages. There's a lot of things that we need to do in our society to deal with the larger issues of poverty. But we shouldn't necessarily take homelessness out of that context and think that there's a homeless problem and a poverty problem, and they're entirely different things. In many ways, dealing with the one will deal with the other.
That makes sense. And I think it's so interesting how housing impacts all of these other issues. So when you talk about education, for example, or concentrations of poverty, that's a direct result of zoning.
Oh, absolutely. The problem is that we tend to ghettoize the poor. We tend to take all the poor people and put them in one area, and then we use zoning laws to keep them there so that they can't move to other areas that might have better jobs, lower crime rates, better schools, and so on. Education in particular, you're educated by your zip code in so many cases. Now, obviously, I'm strongly in favor of school choice programs. I think that people should be able to go to school anywhere they want. But geography matters in those areas. People aren't going to bust their kid, 5 hours to a school to get to a better school. They want to move to that area with a better school. And often they can't do that because of the zoning laws.
Who were the Harvard economists who said zip code is destiny in the U.S.?
Chetty, I think,
Yeah.
and then Raj Chetty, and then his co-authors on any number of papers that shows that it is true that if you take poor people and you take all, there are pathologies of poverty people talk about, but if you lump everybody in the same neighborhood, those pathologies build on each other. You have more crime, you have fewer jobs, the schools go downhill, and all of those sorts of things. What you really want to be able to do is to let people live spread out throughout the society so they can benefit from the advantages that wealthier people have.
Right, and exclusionary zoning, as the name implies, was created to exclude poorer people from richer areas.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the history of zoning, just how tied it was to trying to keep those people out of our neighborhood. A lot of it had to do explicitly with race.
Right.
I believe the first zoning law in America was actually in Los Angeles, and it was a very limited zoning law. It was designed to separate commercial from residential, and there's a certain sense to that. Nobody wants the hog farm built next to their house type of thing. But the second zoning law in America was in Baltimore, Maryland. And part of that zoning ordinance specifically forbids you from selling or renting an apartment to anyone who was not already the majority race on your block. That was later copied by Richmond, Virginia, Birmingham, Alabama, a number of other places like that to implement racial segregation of housing.
Oh, yeah. I just read Color of Law, and when you look at the history of housing policy in the U.S., it is very explicitly aimed at racial residential segregation.
And people might not say it today,
No.
but it still has the same purpose and it still has the same motivation in many cases.
Absolutely. And even if it's not consciously racist, which it often is, it is pretty consciously classist. When you look at words like neighborhood character or, it doesn't fit in or, those people, it's pretty clear that people are using the land use regulation to control what kind of person is living next to them.
Well, that's right. And race and class in America are inextricably linked because of income levels and poverty among African Americans and others.
Which is caused by our racist housing policy.
We have a cycle going on.
It's almost cyclical.
It's almost to see these things working together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, they can look to the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, or FREOPP. It's freopp.org on the web. We are kind of a unique think tank that we are committed to open free markets, but we also devote our entire work to people who are at the lower half of the income scale. Any efforts that we undertake, any projects and studies that we do are exclusively done for people to bring people up at the lower end of the income scale and how we can make them advance. There's a lot of think tanks out there that help the rich and deal with what's the marginal tax rate on your second billion. That's not us. We are targeting people who need help the most, and I'm thrilled to be working for them, and I'm thrilled to be here with you.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that you joined FREOPP. I love that FREOPP exists. I love a lot of the scholars that you have. Don Blanks is amazing.
Oh, yes.
So many great people, so much great work. So you're about to publish your paper on the solutions to homelessness and also on the definition of poverty. What else are you working on?
Well, I did a paper not long ago on alternatives to reparations, the fact that we owe a moral debt that we owe African Americans in this country. Martin Luther King talked about the promissory note that had come back insufficient funds. It's still not being paid. So we have an obligation there. But on the other hand, sort of race-based reparations are impractical. They're not going to work. They would cause more harm than good in the long run, as well as being enormously divisive. California came up with a thing that was going to pay millions of dollars to every African American family. That's simply not going to happen. But that doesn't mean we don't have the things that we can do that are racially not neutral on their face. They'll have a positive benefit of African Americans. That's things like eliminating exclusionary zoning, surprise, surprise, dealing with our failed education system, dealing with our failed criminal justice system. There are things we can do in those regards. So those are all things that we need to be looking at.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that you would close the wound before you, or the analogy you use, I think, is really good about homelessness is repair the boat before you start bailing water. And I think that's true of racism as well, in that we have a leaky boat, in that these systems are created in such a way as to oppress Black Americans. Why not fix those systems first and foremost, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think you can do that in a way that doesn't have to be race explicit.
Right. So, like, if the average African American family is having to pay a greater percentage of their income toward housing than the average white American family, which is true, and that's deeply, deeply contributing to the racial wealth gap. If the average African American person comes from a family who is in greater poverty, so a greater percentage of their income has to go to helping their family, as opposed to a white person who can build intergenerational wealth because they don't have to give their money back home, right? If those things are happening, giving African Americans more money is helpful, obviously, but if you don't fix the system, then that money doesn't go as far.
No, that's right. That's why I have problems with things like the Biden administration. I know is all in on the affirmative furthering family Fair Housing Act.
Okay.
Which is essentially an exercise in bean counting. It takes a community and looks at it and says, how many Black families live in this community? How many white families live in this community? How many Hispanic families live in this community? And then we're gonna move people around and measure them out so they all come out with what we consider to be a fair representation.
How does that work?
Not well.
It seems like you would just do what we've always done and change the lines of what counts as a community.
Well, I think that'll end up being done in the long run as well, and it's why. And plus, you end up breaking up communities. I mean, African American communities, a lot of them have rich histories.
Well, that's worked well in the past to break up African American communities.
Yes, our urban renewal program was one of our great successes.
Highway Act, yeah, that's been great.
And things like that. So I think that that sort of bean counting where it's racially explicit doesn't work. But what we've been talking about, if you give it exclusionary zoning, you're going to naturally have changes in housing patterns where African Americans are going to move to communities they didn't move to before, and you're going to have that, but it's on a different type of basis than sort of trying to force things into a certain framework, because that's what the numbers say.
And it's kind of wild to me. So we have this project that we're building in Huntsville called Mill Creek, and it's a mix of public housing and market rate housing and what they're calling like workforce housing or middle income housing. And that's like awesome in a way. You know, it is exactly what we need. We need neighborhoods to have a mix of incomes and a mix of uses. But again, each unit of housing is slated to cost $400,000. Do you know what would result in a mix of incomes and a mix of uses and not cost $400,000 per unit? Getting rid of zoning that separates the incomes and the uses.
Yeah, there's a number of studies out there that show the impact of exclusionary zoning and how if you remove exclusionary zoning, you simply create more mixed-use housing. It was big for a while. They were going to have sort of inclusionary zoning, where we're going to require that if you built a house, you had to have so
Right.
many low-income units in it, or you had to have so many stores in it that sold at certain types of goods and things like that.
Yeah.
It turns out that simply getting rid of the zoning laws altogether builds more low-income units than you were mandating into the inclusionary zoning requirement.
Thank you. I don't want to too much repeat last week's podcast episode because I had a little aside on inclusionary zoning. But yeah, what I'd found is inclusionary zoning actually leads to a net decrease in affordability, except in places where it's implemented along with an upzoning. And in those places, it's the upzoning that did all the work.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You can't. It would start off as a 2,000 unit thing costing $200,000, ends up to be, well, we'll throw in 50 units at $50,000, and then we'll raise the rest of the units to $400,000.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Well, any last thoughts before we let you go?
Yeah, I think that what we need to do is understand that a lot of policies that make us feel good don't necessarily solve the problem. And I think that we end up too often dealing with things in our society right now designed to make us feel good and not to solve the problems. So sometimes we need to look a little deeper into these issues.
Absolutely. No, I think that's super, super important. It is so easy to advocate for policies that give us the feeling that we're on the right side, that give us points for broadcasting our affinities, for policies that have the right aesthetics, that create the right feelings. And that is fine in and of itself. But when you look at the data, a lot of those policies actually make the problems they're supposed to be solving worse, or simply fail to solve the problems they're supposed to solve, but create other problems along the way. And so I think it's not sexy, but if you're going to get interested in policy and you're going to advocate for policy on one side or the other, I do think you have a responsibility to be familiar as much as you can with what the evidence says is the likely result of that policy. And again, like that sounds so obvious, but it's so rare. I mean, just look around in your life and look at any policy debate and ask yourself, like, what does the evidence say? Few people are asking that question.
As usual, I don't think I could have said it any better. And I think that people who want to get involved and deal with housing problems and deal with homelessness in Huntsville really need to get in touch with Housing for Huntsvillians and a group that's actually doing something.
Thank you. And if you're at all interested in poverty, housing, welfare, UBI, issues of racial justice as far as policy is concerned, follow Mike's work. He's at FREOPP. Mike Tanner, if you just Google Mike Tanner, you'll find him. He's constantly putting out amazing original research and literature reviews of, again, what the empirical evidence says about what policies actually solve the problems that they're supposedly intended to solve, especially when it comes to welfare and poverty. This is an area where we've had a lot of feel-good policies. We've had a lot of feel-bad policies, a lot of policies aimed at punishing people into acting right as if this is some kind of moral failing, again, as you said, when we understand poverty, precarity, racism, these are systemic issues and they cannot be solved on an individual basis. They have to be solved on a systems level. And shaming people not only doesn't work, but it's counterproductive. We need solutions that are cooperative, that are evidence-based, that are compassionate. And so I really appreciate all your work on this. And thank you for coming to speak to us at our last happy hour. That was incredible. We had such a great turnout. We had such great questions. Thank you for coming in and kind of doing a recap of your paper on our podcast. And thank you so much for listening.
My pleasure, and preach it, sister.
All right, we will be back next week, but also make sure to check out Mike's talk over from last night. We have it recorded and posted to YouTube. That's the Huntsville New Liberals YouTube channel. Just look up. Yeah, I'll add a link to our YouTube page, but yeah, just Google or YouTube search it and it'll be there. But thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope everyone is having a great holiday season so far. Thank you for tuning in to Housing for Huntsvillians. This podcast is a project of Huntsville New Liberals. Sign up for our newsletter and RSVP to our monthly happy hour at huntsvillenewliberals.com.